we have an incredible event ahead of us. That was the genesis of which was a breakfast that Sumant and I had in Dubai last December during the climate conference. And Sumant, as Bruce is going to tell us later on, started and is leading together with his lovely wife, Vaishali, here, the leading renewables solar company in India, and is truly one of the innovating companies in that space in the world. And today we're going to hear more about that. I want to say a little bit about the school and a little bit our emphasis on climate, and then I'm going to sort of pass it on. But I talk to people oftentimes about what are big things that the business school needs to be doing or engaging in right now. What are important changes that are going to change our lives, going to shape your own career path for our students in the audience. So, you know, I'm an engineer, so I'm going to say technology and AI, climate, all right? I think US-China is important, and it's going to be something that is going to be an interesting topic for all of us in the future. And I think life sciences and, you know, medicine. Like if you think 50 years into the future, what are the things that are going to change the world? It's going to change our lives, going to change what, you know, our day-to-day routines, everything. Medicine is one, technology, AI is another. Our efforts to address climate change is going to be another one. It's going to create jobs. It's going to disrupt the way we live. It's going to create incredible opportunities. So for the students, I'm digressing, but for the students, oftentimes they say, what area should I get into? You know, it's hard. You know, everybody should do what their passion, and they feel passionate, they find purpose. It's always easy to also pick an area that by itself is going to grow quite a bit, because you don't have to be very good at picking if you know the area is going to grow, all right? Whereas if you go into an area that is saturated, you better pick very carefully in the beginning. So, you know, climate is going to be an area that I think is going to grow quite a bit. So for us here, we're investing deeply in curriculum. We're building new courses all the time. We're expanding the courses that we have built. We're creating synergies with the engineering school, the climate school, you know, SEPA, et cetera. You know, like we're trying to basically create the most comprehensive curriculum in that space, fully understanding that the curriculum is changing very dynamically. So the courses that we teach right now are gonna perhaps look kind of silly 5 years from now. So we need to be updating as we go and being very deliberate about that. We're investing in research, and we're investing in sort of trying to bring the best examples that we know about in that space, and use Columbia to sort of export them and explain them to the world. Because I think that's another gap. The gap is like, I want to do something and I don't quite know how to do it. I don't know who's doing it well. What are the right business models? Which gets me to a last bit that I want to talk about. I want to talk about two more things, and then I'm going to sort of got to join another event on the other side of the campus. But our effort to address climate change is as much a climate science issue, an engineering issue, a policy issue. It's a business issue, okay? We're missing business models. We're missing incredible financing approaches. We're missing incentives. We're missing sort of the way that businesses, or sort of how businesses will implement innovative solutions and then scale them. ReNew is an example of a company that is doing that, but we need to do it across the board. And so, you know, we as a business school need to be deeply into that space. I mentioned curriculum, and I want to say something else that we're going to be talking about tomorrow again with Bruce, which was timed right at my breakfast with Sumant at COP. So last year at COP in Dubai, we announced together with some partner schools that we're going to create an initiative, we're launching an initiative, we'll call it the Open Climate Curriculum Initiative, where we're going to sort of put our material in. I'm using this is the royal use of the word. I'm not putting my material in because I don't teach in that space. But, he was patient zero. He was the first person I talked to. He was like, what do you think about that idea? So we're going to sort of build our own syllabi and our own cases and our own lecture notes, but we're going to sort of share with the world so that, other schools that don't sort of work in that space as deeply and as intensely as we do can actually go into that place, create their own courses, borrow from our own cases, and then launch courses in their own institutions. They can literally copy our own course, or they can assemble other courses, copy the MIT course or the Wharton course and the Columbia course, and we're doing it with Wharton, with Harvard, with MIT, with Kellogg, Berkeley, the bunch of schools. And we've created a system that in some sense people can go to as academics. They can search the database. There's an AI tool that can allow you to say, I would like to build a syllabus of a course that talks about renewable energy, talks about climate finance, and has 2 sessions on X, and then it starts assembling things for you. The reason I'm saying that is a tool to both export to others what we're doing here and in other schools, but also is a place where people from other universities come to collaborate and potentially co-develop courses, which is important because this area is going to be very dynamic over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And most professors don't like that. They like it in their research, but not in their teaching, okay? They like to teach the same thing every year rather than change what they teach every year. So, in climate, we'll have to change a lot. So this initiative helps us with that. So we're all in that space because I think it's strategically important. And I'm going to pass it to my partner, Bruce Usher, who is co-director of the Tamer Institute for Social Enterprise and Climate Change. And he's one of our wonderful faculty members here at the school, also a wonderful educator that thankfully we don't give him a teaching award every year. He could have been, for those of you that are taking his courses, you probably know what I'm talking about, that will lead us through a discussion with Sumant. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very, very much. Okay.
Thank you, Costis.
Bye.
Thanks for opening that. So it's a real pleasure and honor to have this conversation with Sumant Sinha here today. We're here during Climate Week, New York Climate Week. And if you've been to any of the activities or just been reading about what's going on, you sort of think that New York's the center of the climate world at the moment. But the reality is a lot of the action in climate is not happening here in New York. It's not even happening here in the US. It's happening in countries like India. That's where you're seeing the greatest growth, the greatest acceleration. We were chatting just before over a brief lunch about how fast things are happening in India, and in many ways a much more favorable environment for the energy transition. So really looking forward to this conversation. Sumant founded ReNew Power. He's CEO, chairman of ReNew Power. It's now one of the largest, not now the largest, renewable energy developer in India. Costis mentioned solar, but you're also doing energy storage, green hydrogen, other parts of the clean energy transition. Listed on the NASDAQ Stock Exchange in 2021, now a multi-billion-dollar market cap. And as some of you know, also an author. So you get the fossil-free book, which I have a copy in my office. I read, and I think it's a terrific book.
Thank you.
Really, really, really good information there. So I want to talk about climate change. I want to talk about India. I want to talk about the energy transition. But you're an entrepreneur, and a number of our students are interested in entrepreneurship. So I thought maybe we could start by asking you about your journey as an entrepreneur, what lessons you might share with our students on that journey, and particularly entrepreneurship in the clean tech, clean energy sector? We can start there.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, Bruce, thank you so much for having me. And as Costis said, it started off, with that conversation that we had in Dubai, and it's taken us a while to get this done. But I'm glad that it's finally happening, and that I'm here talking to the students who are interested in this area. So, entrepreneurship is a very interesting topic, of course. And I didn't come to entrepreneurship immediately after I left school. I worked for many years, and I worked, in fact, almost for about 20 years before I decided to become an entrepreneur. But I thought deeply about entrepreneurship and what it might take to be successful as an entrepreneur. And what I realized is that either you become an entrepreneur right out of school, when you don't have, where sort of your aspirations are the highest, where in some ways your naivety is also the highest. You expect that the world will sort of come to your feet, and things will happen in your direction. And so that's when a lot of people start. I didn't start at that time because, like a lot of you, I'm sure here, you want to get that job, and there are people around you, and you start interviewing, and then once you get a job, then you get locked in. And then I found that companies are very good at keeping you hooked. It's that next raise, it's that corner room, it's that eating in some special lounge, or traveling in business class. So there's always something that they keep in front of you that sort of keeps you going, right? And so you don't question a lot of these things. But I had, at some level, always wanted to become an entrepreneur, and I don't know why. It was something that I can't fully explain. And I realized that the biggest thing about becoming an entrepreneur is about taking risk. And all of us, when you're doing your jobs, are quite comfortable. And it's not just what you're giving up at that time, but the future path that you might be giving up as well. And so you have to literally push yourself out of your comfort zone to take risk. And there is no guarantee that you'll be successful in whatever you do, because there are many people who try entrepreneurship and only very few succeed. So you have to have the ability of knowing that you could be one of the failures, because it's not written anywhere, that you'll be the one who'll be successful. So you have to have that mentality of knowing that you might fail. So that's one thing that is very important. The second thing, first, of course, is take the risk. Second is you need to have the ability of being able to take failure in your stride. And the third thing is you need to know what you want to do, obviously, right? I had been, like I'm sure many of you in this room, I had been a finance guy. As a finance guy, you don't really learn anything, right? Unfortunately. So you don't really learn any new technology. You don't learn anything, any new business model, right? You just keep doing the same things over and over again, maybe advising other people, or if you're a capital markets guy, then raising capital, or whatever it might be, right? So the question for me was, what do I know that is different and unique that allows me to succeed as an entrepreneur? And I worked in banking here in the US for about 10, 11 years after I finished here. And then I'd gone back to India, and I worked in the Indian corporate sector as a finance person. But then, at some point, I got a chance to get into the sustainability area. This is about 17, 18 years ago. And much like you, because I know you started teaching the course here in 2004, I also had the feeling that sustainability and climate change seemed like something that might become really significant in the future. And it was still relatively early. So my thought was that here's a sector where if I get in early, I can learn some new things that perhaps then might give me some expertise that I may be able to parlay into something entrepreneurial. But I did not know what it might be. So I joined a company that was operating in the space. And after a couple of years of learning the sector, I felt that was the time then to jump off. And that's what I did then.
Very good. Thanks for starting off on that. I should say, since we're gonna have some questions, discussion, but we're gonna open up to general questions before we're done. So a lot of opportunity, and please think of questions for Sumant as we get to that point. So let's take it from you talk about opportunity. Where do you see opportunity today? In which countries, regions, technologies? If you're a young person, Costis mentioned, always look for the growth, right?
Yeah.
That's where opportunity lies. Where do you see it at the moment?
I actually think that almost any area within climate change today is a terrific opportunity because we are really at the cusp of this whole area beginning its growth point. And I think sort of we are, an inflection point is not just maybe a day or a year, but I think over a few years, we've sort of passed an inflection point where we all now know that climate change is a real issue, right? And we haven't even started dealing with it yet. And it's going to take us at least, I would say, the next 3 to 4 decades to really get on top of this problem. And there'll be opportunities in basic things like putting up new renewable energy capacity like we are doing. There'll be opportunities in things like green hydrogen. There'll be opportunities in batteries, new technologies, in waste recycling, in digital that allows you to manage all of these assets better. There'll be a whole host of opportunities that will be emerging. Climate forecasting, better modeling, around green hydrogen itself, there'll be many new things that will be coming up. So there will be a lot of opportunities in this sector over the next many years. And those of you who are thinking of starting careers now, I think you're incredibly fortunate because you have the ability to have a fairly long runway in the sector now. And so I would say there's a ton of opportunity almost in every functional area. And geographically also, I would say that most countries are still at very early stages on their clean energy transition. And whether it's the US or India or the European Union. So most countries are still very, very early stage. So I would say geographically, it's, wherever you happen to be, there'll be opportunity there.
And more specifically for students and for you as a managing company, where's the skills gap on the business side? Where are business skills in, I don't say short supply, but where are those skills in particular, there may be gaps or opportunity today?
I think that as all of these newer areas develop, the reality is that there isn't anybody doing those things right now. So I think if you have strong functional knowledge, right, whether it's finance or whether it's marketing or business development or any of those areas, I think if you overlay onto that a strong technical knowledge of whatever sector or whatever area you want to get into, I think that is really sufficient at this point, right? Because there just aren't enough people who are trained and who have the knowledge of what's happening in this area. So I think if you can spend a few years just understanding the technical aspects of how to create a business or how to run a business or technology in our sector, then I think that'll be really useful.
Okay. Let's talk now a little bit more about the clean energy transition and the business models that are leading that transition, opportunities there. And then, as many of my students know, the next question is, and what are the challenges that we're facing, right? But first on the business model side, what business models do you see out there at the moment that are particularly interesting, appealing, that you'd want to share when it comes to the clean energy transition? Or technologies or sectors?
Yeah. No, as I said, the reality is that almost anything you touch right now in the clean energy transition is going to be growing multifold over the next several years. And whether you're a company like ours that is just basically putting up new wind and solar farms or getting into green hydrogen or storage, those are all fantastic new areas. I think storage, for example, the more we have renewables in the grid, the more the need for storage is going to grow up. Grid management software, virtual PPAs, those are all areas that are going to grow quite dramatically. B2B customers, people like Microsoft and Amazon now setting up data centers and power demand growing around that. I was just talking to a young person the other day, and he said that right now, for example, data centers need firm power of, let's say, whichever amount they require, and it's very hard to get that firm power through renewable energy, as we all know. And so the underlying assumption is that the data center has to operate at a certain level all the time. But the question is it easier to move electrons to the data center or to move data away from that data center to somewhere else? And therefore, can you actually have the data center demand sort of going up and down in response to the supply side going up and down, right? And move the data processing to other data centers, because connectivity through fiber optics between data centers is a lot easier to put up today then transmission connectivity in the US particularly, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, that's a new idea. Anybody can try to pursue something like that. So like that, there'll be a lot of, if you just sit down and brainstorm, I'm sure you guys will come up with many different interesting new things that can be done.
Yeah. And what are the challenges you see generally to the overall transition? Then the next thing I want to talk about is India. Let's get to India, because that's our primary focus here.
Yeah,
but
sure.
Just sort of big picture challenges that you see.
So the biggest challenges, I think, today, I look at it from a business standpoint and from a climate standpoint, and the answer is different in both. From a business standpoint, there's going to be terrific amounts of growth, even though there are constraints. I mean, those constraints will basically mean that instead of growing at 100% a year, you'll grow at 25% a year, right? From a climate standpoint, we do need to grow at 100% a year. And so we will not be able to meet the climate targets, but we will meet anybody's business targets. But more prosaically, the challenges today, of course, are in most countries are around land and permitting. They're around transmission infrastructure. They're around the usage of storage. They're around the cost of green hydrogen and green ammonia, because those are just too expensive right now compared to the alternative. And policies in most countries are not heading in the right direction, unfortunately. That's a big problem. Multilateral negotiations are very slow. And it's the classic sort of problem of why should I do my bit when the other guy is not doing their bit, right? And if I do what I need to do, and if nobody else does what they're supposed to do, then what's the point? So therefore, why even bother? So, all the countries collectively have to move forward at the same time. And doing that with 190 countries, where potentially the largest country is likely to potentially be out of the whole climate conversation, that's a difficult thing to really manage.
Yeah, the political challenge remains daunting.
Yeah.
But it's a very interesting point you made. Most business people anywhere in the world are very happy growing a business 20, 30% a year. That's extraordinary growth. But on climate, it's not fast enough. So
not at all.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So let's talk about India. And we had a nice conversation before this event about what's going on in renewable energy and clean energy in India, and some real interesting lessons there. Let's start with what are the competitive advantages of India when it comes to the energy transition? What's there, and also, of course, what are some of the challenges you see as well?
Okay. Well, that's a pretty big question. So I'll take a bit of a step back and launch into the answer.
Sure.
So first of all, just for everybody to understand, India's power market, or the electricity market, which as we all know is 25% typically of energy demand, is about 425,000 megawatts or 425 gigawatts, okay? The US by comparison is about 900 gigawatts or maybe 1,000 gigawatts. China is perhaps now 2,000 gigawatts, okay? But India is the third largest market. This market demand, the market is growing at about 7 to 8% a year, which is unlike most other parts of the world where actually there is no demand growth. Now in the US with data centers, there's some little bit of growth popping up. Yeah. But in India, growth is about 7, 8% a year. Now, renewables today has become cheaper than fossil fuel-based power supplies. And so for anybody who wants more power supply, the go-to really should be renewables because it's cheaper, right? And it's not just cheaper by a small amount, but it's cheaper by almost half. So if coal-based power in India, which is the alternative because India doesn't have gas, costs about 5 cents to 6 cents, solar costs about 3 cents. Wind costs about 3.5 cents. So there's a pretty big delta. And now this is just the raw cost of the power. Now when you start firming it up with batteries and so on, of course costs go up. But there's a lot of room for those costs to go up, and therefore a lot of ability for us to bring in storage solutions as well. Now with 8% demand growth on a fairly large base, what that means is that we need to add about 70 to 80,000 megawatts of new renewable capacity to meet that demand growth from renewables only. Now keep in mind that the total installed capacity in the grid today is only about 450 gigawatts. Now we need to add almost 70 new gigawatts of additional capacity every year in renewables to meet that demand growth. And that's a pretty tough task because you have to acquire that much land, you have to get that much equipment, you have to have that many trained people, need to build that many roads to take the wind turbines, and get that financing, get the permitting. So it's a pretty big challenge, and it requires about $50 to $70 billion of investment just on the generation side. Then you need to build out transmission lines. and storage solutions. So when you sort of project this out to 2030, India has to invest almost $500 billion in generation, transmission, and just storage, just to meet power demand growth. And even then we'll have a deficit against demand growth. So, go as fast as we can is not going to be sufficient to meet our aspirations as a growing country. Now, per capita power demand in India, power consumption in India is about maybe a 15th that of the US. So only about 7-8%. So as India grows, we're obviously going to have massive increase in power demand. Now, keep in mind that India's carbon emissions, to relate it back to climate, are already about 8% of the world's carbon emissions. The US is what, about 15% perhaps?
Yep.
So if we just increase our carbon emissions in line with power demand growth, and we increase it even 5 or 10 times, carbon emissions are going to go through the roof massively, right? So therefore, India has realized we cannot follow the same normal path of development that all other countries have followed. And therefore, we have to grow through renewables. And therefore, the clean energy transition is really fundamentally important in India, and also for the rest of the world, that we actually go down a different path. And that's what the government has decided to do. And the interesting thing is that we all tend to focus on 2030, right? But if I sort of extend the timeline of forecast by another 20 years beyond 2030 to 2050, right? What is happening is that energy demand, the broader energy demand in India, is going to grow at about 4 to 5% a year, notwithstanding energy efficiency improvements and all of that. And then within that, you have electricity accounting, going from about 20% to about 40%. And within electricity, renewables going from about 15% right now to about 70 or 80%. And so when you do the math, your current installed renewable energy capacity has to go from the 2030 target of 500 gigawatts. It has to increase to almost 5,000 gigawatts in the 20 years after that, which is 5 times the installed capacity of power generation in the US today. Okay? So the numbers are just unbelievably staggering. And I can't even conceive of how we're going to get this job done. But that's what we need to do. And part of the reason is that 3 megawatts of renewable capacity is equal to 1 megawatt of, let's say, gas or coal. And therefore, it is a lot more capital intensive. So, but that's really what the challenge is.
Back to that point Costis made about the growth. You just that data just backs up that point. You mentioned before when we were chatting about how India, perhaps counterintuitively to me or naively to me, that the process of developing renewable energy projects is a relatively straightforward process, that the political support has been pretty consistent. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so, I think that, as I said earlier, this government, at least the Indian government currently, recognizes that we have to follow a totally different path of growth. And therefore, they're pushing very hard on coming up with the right sets of policies to encourage more renewable energy. What also actually works in India's sort of desire to go down this path is the fact that India is an energy deficient country, unlike the US, which has a lot of oil and gas. India doesn't have any oil and gas. And so India imports about $200 billion worth of fossil fuels every year. And it's a real Achilles heel of India's economy. And every time prices go up and down, the Indian rupee also sort of goes up and down along with that. So when I say prices, I mean of oil and gas. So the government has recognized that we need to cut that dependence on imports. And because renewables are all within your borders, it enhances national security massively, and it decreases dependence on imports of fossil fuels. So that's what we are trying to do. So the first step is to try to, by the way, we are also actually, we're also a coal-dependent country, and all the coal is mined in India itself. So we're going to sort of stop doing that at some point. But we also then are really pushing forward on the green hydrogen and green ammonia economy, because a lot of the energy, the rest of the non-electricity part of the energy value chain also needs to be addressed. So the government is pushing hard on that direction as well. So it's, the idea is to bring down cost, to clean up the environment, help in climate change, of course, and decrease dependence on other countries for imports. So it's a pretty big issue for the country.
So you've got,
That's
you've got those macro tailwinds that are supporting renewable energy development in India. Challenges, siting, land, is land capacity a limiting factor?
Yeah, it is massively. India's population, as you guys would know, is 1.4 billion people. Our landmass is a third the size of the US. So our population density is 12 times that of the US. There isn't a lot of free land that isn't already cropped or farmed. And so therefore, whenever we are putting up projects, we put up most of our solar projects in the western part of India. There's a desert there, and there's very good natural radiation. So the issue there is building our transmission lines fast enough from there to the rest of the country. But at least land is available. In wind, however, a lot of the land is intermingled with farming lands. And so the problem that we face is acquiring land. And then every single wind turbine ends up becoming a battle to get access to. Because it's one thing to get access to the location, to buy the land and then get the turbine there. But you also have to get the 33 kV line there. And you have to get the crane to move there. And these cranes, I don't know how many of you have seen an actual wind turbine recently. Just a few of you. I would encourage you guys to actually see a modern wind turbine. They are really, really big, right? They're 150 meters high. 150 meters is maybe higher than the Eiffel Tower, each one of them, right? And typically, each blade is about 75 to 80 meters long. Okay, the trailers that you get, the maximum size trailers, at least in India that you get, are about 50 meters long. And so the blade hangs off at the back end of it by about 20 meters. And you have all these small little roads and turning radiuses are very short and narrow. And so taking the blade to the site is a task by itself. And no site is right next to the road, right? They're all sort of deep inside because you can't build next to the road. And so you have to actually build roads, pretty big, broad roads to take 50-meter big trailers through 5 kilometers of farmland. And you have to probably deal with 100 farmers to get that access, right? And 99 farmers will give you the access, and the last guy is going to say, you know what? So that's what happens all the time.
Yeah.
And the same thing applies to transmission lines. And those are even worse because, one turbine at a time is one thing, but if you're connecting the whole wind farm, and you have like 300 turbines standing idle, and then that one farmer says, I want 20 times the price, you feel tempted to give it to the guy, except for the fact that you know that the other 99 guys are then going to be standing at your doorstep all wanting that extra amount. Yeah. So it's those practical problems that actually create the biggest issues for us.
I can imagine. But India does have one national grid,
yes,
right? And that's an advantage.
That's a big advantage, yeah. I think there's some things that the Indian government has done that are relatively smart, which is unlike any other part of the world. India has a single national grid, which means you can put up the power capacity anywhere in the country and wheel it to any other part of the country. And the big benefit for renewables is that we are not charged for it, which is that cost is socialized across all the consumers of the country. So therefore, for the buyers of the power, it's very cheap because all they have to pay is the cost of generation and not the cost of transmission. So now those rules are going to start to change from next year onwards. And that will then mean a slightly different set of installations that we'll have to think about, maybe more at the regional levels rather than in just one or two parts of India. But I think that's been a big benefit that the government has given to renewables. So policy, I think, in India has been quite enlightened so far on renewables, and that's what has allowed us to add so much capacity, frankly. And as I said, the reasons are several for that.
Yeah. Speaking of policy, just bring it back to the U.S. for a second. We have an election coming up here. Does that outcome impact the clean energy transition from your perspective? Does it impact any of the transition in India? What are your thoughts on that?
I think only indirectly it impacts us. I would say substantially it does not, because we are pretty much operating within India, and so therefore, and as I said, in some ways the rest of the world has taken the view that they will do what they have to do, irrespective of what the US is doing. And we've had 4 years of prior experience when the US was not really part of climate conversations, and the rest of the world just carried on. And I would say kudos to the rest of the world for that, because the rest of the world could easily have said, you know what, let's also just sit it out for some years. And so I think that it doesn't really impact India that much, except for the fact that we export solar modules to the US. And so how will that change? What will happen to the IRA? Will there be solar manufacturing capacities that get set up here? Will imports from China get blocked? Those are things that we don't know, and those will obviously depend on the administration that comes in.
Yeah. Interesting times. We live in interesting times. Speaking of changes, and Costis mentioned this, the growth in AI, data centers, it's a global growth. Seems to be a bit of a two-edged sword when it comes to climate. On the one hand, the power of this AI to help us address climate change is real. On the other hand, it's huge sucking up of power. As you said, for the first time in the US in decades, we're actually seeing demand growth because of these data centers. What's the story in India in terms of growth in power demand, specifically for data centers, AI? Is that helping to drive renewables growth?
Yeah, so I think eventually it will. We don't have that many AI-related data centers yet. They were the normal data centers that were being set up earlier, and those were already leading to demand growth happening. Now, I think as we start seeing more the AI chip-heavy data centers come, or energy-intensive data centers coming up, that will probably lead to more demand. But as I said, even without all of that, power demand is growing at about 8%. So I think it'll just be incremental to the demand that is already growing in the country.
Yeah.
So I think,
A little more icing on the cake.
Yep.
So I just want to ask one or two more questions, and then let's open it up. Get all your questions out. Your book, there's a chapter you title it "The Imminent Third Transition: Rise of Renewables." What makes renewable energy imminent?
As opposed to here and now already. Yeah, I was writing about it more in the context of the sweep of history, as it were. So it was a little bit of a grandiose statement on my part. And really, I was relating it to the fact that we've had two energy transitions in our history as humanity. One, when we went from our own muscle power to, in some ways, or not just ours, but also, let's say, horse-drawn carriages, whatever, We went from there to coal. So that was the first big energy transition that we had. And that upended a lot of sectors, and the steam engine came in, and that led to transportation getting totally revolutionized, and so on. And then, of course, we've had the oil and gas revolution, which in some ways is coexisting with the first one, which is coal. And now we are in the midst of, or the beginnings of, the third big energy transition, which is now a move entirely to clean energy. And eventually all fossil fuels will get replaced. But today, fossil fuels still account for 85-90% or more of all energy demand. And so, the reason I said imminent is because we're still at the beginning of that transition. And that is why there's so much opportunity for everybody in this room.
Yeah, we are at the beginning of a very massive transformation. The challenge in writing a book, and the fact it's a lot of hard work to write a book, is by the time you write it and publish it and put it out, the world's already changed a bit, right? True. And you first published the book in 2020, and then you just recently, 23, came up with an updated version, which is what many of you have in the classroom. What has changed since the book came out? What if you could rewrite the book right at this very moment, what else would you add or change to it?
No, first of all, you're absolutely right. Writing a book is really, really hard work. It took me 2 years to get it done. And then I gave it to the publisher, and I thought that was it. My job was done. Yeah. And then I had to read it another 10 times after that. So by the time it got finished, I was quite wiped out. And then, trying to edit it and coming out of the second edition is actually, I found, even harder, because then you have to go through it even more millimetrically and figure out what has changed and what has not changed. But what has changed fundamentally is, I think that green hydrogen, of course, I've written about in the book. I think when I wrote about green hydrogen, I was more optimistic than I am today. Why
is that?
The reason is that the world is going much slower on green hydrogen than I had anticipated, right? It's more expensive. I had thought countries are more serious about biting the bullet and paying the subsidies or forcing their companies to do the transition. But I find that they're not. And it's distressing to see that. And so I see green hydrogen perhaps taking off slower than I had anticipated earlier. On the flip side, I also see that renewable energy is going to be growing perhaps faster than what I had anticipated globally. So I think those are the two big changes that I would point to.
So let's hit some questions. It is New York Climate Week. So as we take questions, just one last question for you, Sumant. What have you noticed at New York Climate Week? What's been interesting or something that just caught your attention in the past couple of days here?
So, one thing that did catch my attention, which I was aware of intellectually, but I did not really know the details of, is the whole area of energy efficiency. It seems a little bit boring, frankly, which is why perhaps I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about it. But, the data that I was at this presentation by the Rocky Mountain Institute, which said that of 600 exajoules of energy that is produced, only about 277 is finally used. The balance goes waste. And so if at the end point you save that 1 exajoule of energy, you actually save 2.5 exajoules of manufacturing of the energy, right? Which was not something that I was aware of, certainly these numbers. And secondly, that electrification actually increases energy efficiency also.
That's right.
And so therefore you need to actually burn less or consume less energy if you electrify more. And so apart from the obvious benefits of electrification, which is that you can then provide the clean energy into it, there is also the fact that you improve the energy efficiency, which is something, again, that was pretty interesting. So I came away from that presentation with the view that energy efficiency is where a lot of the action is going to be at. It's an area that not a lot of people are focusing on. And so to the extent that any of you guys are thinking about entrepreneurship, that's one area that definitely is still in very, very early stages. And at COP28 in Dubai, the target that was set was to double energy efficiency. So the world has been improving energy efficiency at the pace of about 2% a year. And the idea is to increase that to 4% a year. And there are ways to do that. And I would encourage all of you to read that RMI report because it's quite useful.
Yeah, RMI does great work in this area. And they say that the cheapest watt of electricity is a negawatt.
That's right.
Not
exactly.
using a watt.
Exactly.
Which of course makes sense. Yeah. So questions for Sumant from anyone? Yeah, sure. Oh, yes, we do have mics as well.
Hi, good afternoon. So in 2023, I had a question regarding coal versus solar. We saw in India coal actually outpace solar in the growth of that year. And since you mentioned it's cheaper to do renewable versus coal, why do you think that is the case?
You're saying coal outpaced solar?
Coal generation outpaced solar?
No, coal generation because of the existing installed capacities are obviously much higher.
Sorry, I meant coal generation growth.
Okay, the growth. So, I think one of the issues is that we added 15 gigawatts of new solar capacity last year. And we probably added more than 5,000 megawatts of coal capacities. Because, as I said, we are energy deficient right now. And we need to add more capacities. And so the government of India is going to keep adding more and more coal as well. Because we are not able to add solar fast enough. So give it another 2-3 years, I think you'll see that reversing itself, and you'll start having much faster growth in solar as well. So I think it's just it's a transition period right now.
I would add that in China we had the same issue a few years ago, and it's now flipped.
Yeah,
fairly quickly. Yeah. Maybe take in the back over here first, and then I'll start with the mics. Go ahead, and then we'll come back to the sides just to spread it around. There we go.
Thank you so much. One question I had is sort of as we're thinking about the long-term energy mix and investment, how does the lifetime of the infrastructure behind renewables and maybe like its upgrade or replacement cycles differ from or compare to that for fossil fuels? And how do you think about that, or how is like the market thinking about that?
Yeah, so typical life cycles are about 25 years. But frankly, we actually haven't got to the end of the life cycle in most installations so far, right? And so we'll have to a little bit wait and see. But my sense is that we can probably, the useful life will continue for another 10, 15, 20 years after that. So we won't need to actually replace those assets. At least in India, you get 25-year PPAs. So we tend to think of 25-year horizons, but that's an artificial horizon. As I said, there's no reason for these things not to carry on longer. Batteries, of course, is a different thing. Batteries, inverters, some other parts of the structures are different. Those may have to get replaced earlier. And of course, I think at some point very soon, you'll start seeing the development of a a recycling industry that will get set up as well. But I think we're really a few years away from that yet. But I think companies that start positioning themselves for that right now will really be in good position subsequently, whenever that whole recycling begins to happen.
Thanks very much. We're here, and then we'll come back to this side.
Hi, I have two comments. So one is regarding the energy efficiency. I just wanted to add in that. So I used to work in the electrical steel sector, which is one way you can improve energy efficiency. So by changing the material that goes into the electrical transformers, the better versions you use, the higher the electric efficiency, energy efficiency. And what I noticed when I was dealing businesses in India is that majority of my Indian customers use the lowest grade, which has the lowest efficiency. So I think by switching to a higher efficiency electrical steel metal, that's one way that we can improve the overall energy efficiency. I just wanted to add that. And actually my question to you is, so I know that India has been doing exceptional job in terms of energy transition, but at the same time I know that it was a very fierce competitive market, domestic Indian market. So I'm specifically curious as to what made ReNew more successful than the other competitors in the market.
Yeah, thank you for that question. No, I think to your earlier comment, I think energy efficiency can be obtained in many different ways. Could be redesign of entire cities, could be redesign of materials, could be redesign of specific equipment, could just be switching your lifestyle changes, so a whole bunch of different things. So it's a pretty broad topic, therefore. Now, to your second question of what has made us successful, I think this is another part of entrepreneurship that is very important, which is starting a company is just one thing, right? Then the question is, what is your ambition? What is your aspiration? And then how do you execute? All of those are very, very important factors, right, as well. And right from the beginning, at least my view was that I wanted to, I didn't want to just flip the business. I wanted to create a company that would actually stand the test of time. And so for me, it was as important to build the organization as it was to build the business, right? So what that meant was we had to have the right culture, the right set of values, the right people, the right internal systems and processes. Those are all things that actually create sustainability within an organization and therefore the business as well. Because it's the organization that has to carry out the business. At some point, and your role as an entrepreneur keeps changing over time. In the beginning, you're used to doing everything yourself. You've got 20 people around you. You know everybody's names. You know what their strengths and weaknesses are. Then you become a 500-person organization. Suddenly, you don't know most of the people. Today, when I go to our cafeteria, I don't recognize most of the people any longer, right? But the organization has to function, and you need to have all these systems and so on in the organization that allow you to keep moving things forward at the right qualitative manner. So I think that is very important, and that's something that we focused on. The second very important thing is having the right sets of financial policies. Because if there's one thing that can get a company to go under, it's the wrong financial management. Okay, so you have to be very mindful of that. So I think that's the second thing that has really helped us. And the third thing really was just a huge amount of focus on execution. And you just have to, for us, we didn't have a lot of capital. I didn't have any capital of my own. I had to go and raise capital. And every time we went to a capital provider, they would ask us, tell us what you said you would do, and did you do that or not? And you had to stay, therefore, reasonably close to what you'd committed to people for them to be able to have the confidence of giving you more capital. And that's very important in a capital-intensive sector like ours. So therefore, execution has been very, very important. And that focus on execution has allowed us to raise more capital than others and therefore grow faster than others. So in effect, in some ways, being more conservative on the financial side, being more focused on discipline on execution is what has actually allowed us to be the most aggressive in terms of growing our business. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but actually that's what happened to us.
Thanks. I know we have some questions over here.
You've already mentioned a lot the big challenge that India is facing to decarbonize, especially when linking that to development goals. at the same time, the current goal of the government to go net zero is 2070. Do you see that goal moving towards like a more Paris Agreement compliant year? And even if not, that goal is explicitly moved forward, do you think that economics and the implicit policy choices will make it possible that India will decarbonize earlier?
Yeah, no, look, that's a terrific question, and you're absolutely right. I think the setting of the target was entirely a political exercise, because who knows what's going to happen 30 years later, right? In terms of technology or economics and stuff like that. So the way we came at our target was that the European countries had set a target of either 2040 or 2050. I think the US was the 2050 target, perhaps.
Right. Yeah.
China said 2060. So we said, okay, 2070. Okay, so it was either that or not have a target at all. And there's a lot of political pressure on India to actually have a target. And so they just said, okay, 2070. Because it's 50 years out, who's going to be around, who's going to monitor it, right? But at least there's a target and people are going to get off our backs, okay, for not having a target. So that's how the target, I think, was set, frankly, okay? And please don't tell anybody outside this room that I just said what I said, okay? But my personal view is that you're absolutely right, technology, economics, all of that is going to mean that there is, we'll probably reach net zero well before that. Because, whatever solutions are going to be implemented in Europe or the US to get them to their net zero targets will have to be economically viable. And if they are economically viable, why would they not get implemented everywhere else in the world, right? And certainly in India, which has been quite at the vanguard of this whole transition. So I'm pretty optimistic that we'll get there much earlier.
Okay, thanks. Lotte? A bunch of my European students are in this corner. We get Euro-focused questions over here.
Thank you for being here. Yeah, I have a bit of more of a philosophical question, I guess. So I'm in a class with Professor Usher, and we had a question whether you would offshore to another cheaper country if you have a manufacturing facility. And you said before in the start of your conversation, why should I do it if no one else is doing it? Or otherwise someone else will do it. So I was curious to hear, because this is a debate I have in my head, what would you answer to someone if they're interested in the climate space, but it's less profitable? What is your answer when someone says, but it's if I don't do it, someone else will do it?
I have the firm conviction that people will deal with climate change only if it's commercially sensible to do so. Otherwise, nobody is willingly going to pay a price for it. At least that's my experience. I mean, at the margin, some European countries will, be willing to pay a higher cost and so on. But the large part of the world will only do it if it's commercially sensible. And that's part of the reason why green hydrogen is not moving forward as rapidly as it should, because it's just more expensive. And so everybody is saying, why should I fund the cost of it? So I think that's where I sort of come out on that issue a little bit, that we have to make things, there has to be business viability. And the amount of capital that we require is just so large that no amount of government spending, no amount of subsidy programs, no amount of multilateral financing is going to help us get anywhere close to the amount of capital we need. That capital is only available in private markets, in institutional markets globally. And that capital, like water, flows to a certain level, that flows to where the returns are what they need to be. Otherwise, that capital is just not going to flow. And if it doesn't flow, you will not be able to get the scale of solutioning that you require. So you need to have a commercial element behind it. Otherwise, it's not going to happen.
Let's come back. I'm going to come back to the middle here. If we have time, we'll get back. We have about another 10 minutes, roughly, 12 minutes, before we have to wrap up. But perhaps, in the middle. Just for those who are online, it's a little easier to hear you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you again. My question was, previous into the discussion, you talked about something that I think is a core issue of climate change to a certain extent, which is the time horizons that people are operating with. The local farmers in India, their time horizon is on a weekly to yearly basis, whereas the time horizon of the government or ReNew is on a much longer scale of decades. given that, what is the sales pitch or the argument that you're making to farmers and people on that local scale and the boots on the ground level? And then what's the conversation happening at an even higher level for the government or other institutions to kind of sell you on that business prospect?
Look, as I said earlier, the underlying basis of all of this has to be commercial. If I go to a farmer and tell the guy, look, Mr. Farmer, 6 months later or 1 year later, you may have catastrophic floods because of climate change, and you're going to be impacted by that. Therefore, sell me your land cheaply so I can put up a wind turbine that might help you prevent having that flood. The guy's not going to understand that, obviously, right? All he cares about is, you bought land from Mr. A at this price, I want the same price or better, right? And if I can farm so much, then you pay me, compensate me for that amount. So those conversations are not related to climate change at all. They're just related to the here and now of what the guy can get in his pocket at that time, right? Now, as you go further up the curve and you start talking to the government, obviously the government is concerned about climate change, and that's why they are willing to push whatever policies they're pushing. And with those, we have very different conversations. But ultimately, we have to solve these very real-life, practical, ground-level issues, without which this whole climate change effort is not going to get off the ground. In the US, for example, you don't have sufficient transmission capacity, as we all know, right? And nobody's building it out. And so my question is, how will the US deal with what they need to do if there's no transmission infrastructure? And why is nobody, it's such a glaringly obvious issue. Why is nobody addressing it? It boggles the mind, right? But this is the kind of obvious shortcomings I find in climate change issues globally. That at one level, everybody understands it, but then at a basic level, people are not able to deal with it. Right? Similarly, in Europe, permitting is a real issue, right? And as our European friends, I'm sure, will tell us, you can take years and years to get approvals because all sorts of, it goes all the way down to the local community and so on. And they can't change the process. So you just can't get approvals. So anyway, I'm digressing from your question, actually.
There's a few things here that boggle the mind, so it's not the only one, I'm afraid to say.
Yeah.
Let's take another question or two over here, and we'll try to get back if we have time, and then we'll have to wrap up.
So I was reading about this desert in in Morocco, where they set up this huge solar farm using traditional technology, where they used mirrors and they heated some oil-centered lamp. And then 20 years later, new technology came and their whole infrastructure sort of became redundant. So when you're making heavy investments, how do you sort of factor in the progress of technology? Because right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, solar panels are 20 to 40% efficient, and it's improving every day. But when you're doing $1 million project, how do you adapt your infrastructure in a way where it can, update itself?
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. No. I think the issue is that. At least for us, when we put up projects, we sign long-term power purchase agreements. Okay, in which case the other side is locked into buying from us for 25 years. So that solves that particular problem. Otherwise, if you just rewind back 5-7 years, solar prices were 4 or 5 times as high as they are right now, right? So if you start having all those guys renegotiating their contracts, then what's the sanctity of any contract? And if you don't have a long-term contract, you won't get any debt financing, and therefore you can't get anything off the ground. So everybody recognizes that, though, fortunately. And so therefore, nobody reneges on contracts. Okay, otherwise, they won't get any more capital in the future. Yeah.
So there was one more right here, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Sinha. My question is about what's your thoughts on energy storage and reliability issues? Because the context is I worked as a consultant for NYSOL, the New York region operators, and their concern was renewable is so cheap right now that gas and oil new plants have no incentives of coming in, and during extreme weather events, that could become a potential threat.
Yeah. No, so I think, look, the grid managers have to be very careful about how they manage the grid, which is that obviously renewables is cheaper, and so you want to have as much renewables as possible. But as you know, on days like this, what do you do if it's cloudy, there's no sun, or if the wind doesn't blow, or there's seasonality in all of these things, or there is, day and night in these situations. So how do you then manage the grid? So, grid operators need to build sufficient redundancy in the whole system, and they need to have sufficient backup generating capacity such that when these events happen, they can call on those generating sources as well. right? Eventually, if we want to move the whole grid off of fossil fuels altogether, then we need to figure out what kind of large-scale storage solutions can we have. And one of those things that we can have is really pumped hydro-based storage solutions, right? Where you just move water to a higher level and then you pull it down when you need to use it. So that's also a storage system, by the way. Like that, you have this company called Energy Vault that has a gravity-based system where they just stack up blocks on top of each other. So it's those kinds of things that will have to provide the longer duration storage. But even those will have limitations because, you know, how many of these can you build after all? And what happens if there is a severe outage for, you know, a much longer period of time? So I think you'll need to have backup systems still reliant on fossil fuels for some time. You may not use them, but you'll have to pay for them, at least as far as capacity charges are concerned.
We have a few more minutes. Let's take the 1 or 2 questions over here, yeah, and then we'll wrap up.
You want to start? Well, first of all, thanks for being here. My question is, maybe it's not a straightforward question, but so everybody's talking about renewable energy and how you power and repower the world in a clean manner. But then what's happened next? So then you have to electrify the consumption, right? So how do you advance in fuel consumption or gas consumption in the houses? So is it realistic for the world to achieve, or some countries actually achieve net zero by 2050? Because renewable energy is just the first step.
Yeah, it is absolutely just the first step. I mean, you know, we are, as I said, electricity accounts for 20% of energy, and within electricity, renewables today probably is, you know, 20% in most grids. So we're just 4 or 5% of the total energy basket as renewables right now. And the balance 95% also will have to be replaced. And you're absolutely right, that does require change on the usage side as well. I mean, and the most obvious example of that is, you know, moving from ICE vehicles to electric vehicles, right? And that whole transition will have its own parameters and factors that will impact it. Are there enough charging stations, for example? What do people feel about range anxiety? Are those cars well designed? Are they too expensive or not? And what does your neighbor say about using an electric vehicle instead of, you know, really snazzy Ford Mustang or whatever it is that it passes for being a really great car these days. So you know, there'll have to be massive changes on the user side, on the consumer side as well, for this change to actually play itself out. But the good thing is that people are working on these problems. You know, solutions are becoming available, and it's now becoming more a question of how rapidly they can get implemented at scale. And we are at the beginnings of that process. So that's why I'm saying over the next 20, 30 years, there'll be a lot of change in all of that. I mean, think about it this way. We've got a whole economic system that has been built over 100, 150 years based on fossil fuels. Now you're trying to replicate all of that, right? Think about the fact that all of us are wired in popular culture. We watch movies where the guy gets on a big, huge bike and guns it hard and all of those things, right? So it's this cultural change also that is required, right? Suddenly you now get onto a motorbike and it doesn't make any noise when it goes. And people are going to say, what the hell? So all of those changes also need to happen, okay? So it's a whole stream of things. But as I said, we are at the beginnings of the change. And I think it's people like you who have to take this whole change forward much faster. And your lifestyle choices, your career choices will all make this happen faster or slower, as the case might be. And I'm not talking about you particularly, of course, but all of you here.
I think that's a nice way to wrap up. I just want to, so Bollywood is our hurdle here then, getting those films made. But in the reality, while the film industry might still look one way at culture, am I correct in saying that in India, 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers have gone very electric? Is that
Pretty
right?
much, yeah.
Pretty much, right?
Yeah,
Is there a better product and the customer likes it?
Yeah. And in fact, again, there was an RMI report recently that said that if India replaces all all vehicles with electric, the biggest area, of course, is large-scale trucking. If that all gets replaced, then in 20 years, then that will lead to an additional demand of 500 gigawatts of electricity to power those electric vehicles.
More demand for renewables, more business for ReNew.
Even more, even more.
More excitement, more opportunity, more growth for all of you in the future. I want to thank those who joined us online for being part of this event, and I want to thank all of you for your attention. Great questions. I wish we could take more questions. Most importantly, Sumant Sinha, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you for having me.